Okay, Global Connections here at 1 o'clock on a given Thursday afternoon with Patrick Bratton. We have reversed our roles, and I am the designated host, at least temporarily, for this show. Patrick is the newly appointed chair of the History and International Studies Department at HBU. Congratulations and welcome.
Thank you very much, Jay. Good to be here. Funny to sit on this side of the stool. If you
See if it feels different. Yeah.
Yes, it does.
I'll pepper you with questions.
Oh, thank you, Jay.
So this is Global Connections, and we're talking about Patrick Bratton parts unknown. But they are known because Patrick has just come back from a 2-week trip to France, and we want to explore that. France is my favorite, actually, my favorite European country.
Oh,
and I love France with all its warts, so to say. You know, it has a great history. It's a history with some successes, some failures, and great art and great culture. So why did you go to France?
That's a relatively easy question to answer. My wife is French, so we go off at least once a year and go visit her family, my in-laws, and then I have a bunch of family. We used to live there for a period of time. So
where?
I've lived in Brittany, which is where my wife's from, the northwest part of France, and I've also done some work in Paris a few years ago.
Fabulous. Fabulous. What a great thing to have. And you're totally fluent, right?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent. All my French friends would know. I mean, I get by. My level of listening comprehension, reading comprehension is quite good. My speaking, I get by, but I make a lot of grammatical mistakes. And don't ask me to write anything.
Okay, well, I'm not, I'm not asking you we should do this show in French. We're not going to do that. But we may throw a French term in here and there. Okay, so your wife is French, and Brittany is where she's from, and you live there and in Paris. What an exciting background. And what do you think about France in general? I mean, does it mean a lot to you as it does to me?
It does. France is one of my favorite. I call it my second home. After I'm U.S. citizen, so America's my first home, but France is my second home. It's always a country that's very very close to me. I would say that I've lived a couple of places abroad, and one of the things that kind of surprised me when I was in grad school, I did the 3 years of grad school in Europe. I spent about 2 years in the UK and a year in France. And no offense to Britain, I'm fond of Britain, but I always thought Britain would be a much more comfortable or place that I would feel more at home rather than France, which is very culturally different. You know, Britain, in some respects, same language, same Anglo-Saxon traditions. I had a much stronger emotional contact and felt much more comfortable in France than I did in my time in the UK. And so ever since that moment, living and studying there, it's been an important place, if you will, inside me.
You know, in heaven, all the policemen are English. All the I got to remember this joke.
All the cooks are French, right?
All the cooks are French, absolutely right. All the mechanics are German. All the lovers are Italian, and the organizers are Swiss.
Right.
That's heaven. In hell, however, it works differently. All the cooks are British.
Oh.
All the all the lovers are Swiss.
Oh,
like the clock.
Right.
All the what were the other categories I covered?
All the policemen.
The policemen are German.
Oh.
I'll end it quickly. And all the mechanics are French. Oh, the organizers are Italian.
Right.
And you know what? It's still funny.
Yeah, it is.
Years later, it's still funny. So this summer, what was your purpose in going back this summer? I'm sorry, this winter.
Well, mostly to catch up with family, just check in on friends and family, that sort of thing. Take my son. We're raising my son to be bilingual.
Oh, great.
So it's good for him to get exposure, to speaking French every day.
Can he get dual citizenship too?
Yes, he has dual citizenship actually.
That's
so,
great.
France is pretty, it's a fairly straightforward process for dual citizenship. And so having to speak French here, I mean, he does speak some French here. There's, the Alliance Française that's here in Hawaii, and so he takes classes often on Saturdays. But
Why don't you tell people what that is?
Oh, the Alliance Française. It's a cultural organization to promote French culture and French language across the world. It has a quite it gets a large amount of its funding from the French government, and it's to put on my international relations hat.
It's like the Confucius Society for the Chinese,
Right, like
which
the
is
Confucius,
funded by the Chinese government.
right, or the Goethe Institute for the Germans, the Japan Foundation. These countries that have made their huge investment in sort of soft power to invest in their sort of cultural diplomacy. And so France is, if we think about French history, it's been a large part of really all the way going back to Louis XIV, right? If you think about the Chateau of Versailles and you think about the dominance of French language and French culture and architecture in the 17th and 18th century, that's the sort of originator of this. And then you have the Alliance Française, which still continues, which is actually quite active here in Hawaii. They do a lot of language courses and things.
So if you wanted to learn French, it'd be a great place to go.
Yeah. They've got a lot of nice programs, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so you go back with your boy.
Yes, with my boy.
And you want to immerse him yet again. Okay, and where do you travel?
Well, we try to spend a lot of time. My wife's from Brittany, which is the sort of Celtic part of France in the northwest. So we spend a lot of time there.
It's the part that goes out, the hook.
The big peninsula.
The peninsula goes way out into the ocean.
So we spent a lot of time there. My son is in a stage where he likes sort of fantasy medieval things, so we went to a lot of castles, and Brittany is a place with castles. The most famous sort of castle-like structure in Brittany, although it's technically not in Brittany, is the Mont Saint-Michel, which we've seen in a lot of movies and things. It's this fortified monastery on an island that at high tide is cut off from the mainland. And this is always the backdrop to some Three Musketeers movie or something. They're going to go rescue somebody that Cardinal Richelieu has imprisoned. And they'll normally have the backdrop of the Mont Saint-Michel there. And it's quite a spectacular. It's the second most visited tourist site in France after the Eiffel Tower. It's well worth your time to visit. It's really quite spectacular.
It is an amazing phenomenon to see it at a distance. Because it's all the way out there, all by itself. And when there's water, okay, fine. But when there's no water, it rises out of the ocean. It's straight up. And walking up is is challenging because it's straight up, and the path goes through these little streets that are all very, very close and tight, including the restaurants.
Yes, yeah, very much. And there's hotels. People have stayed. I've never done it myself, but I've known friends who've stayed overnight there. Some nice restaurants. There's still a working monastery at the top that you can visit. And they've also, because it got involved in a lot of the wars with the English and other people, the Normans and so on, there's fortifications, as a castle is there. It's quite interesting because it's on the border. You have these two sort of historic regions that were independent of France, Normandy and Brittany. And the Mont Saint-Michel, which side it goes on depends upon this river. And for the past several hundred years, the river has made it so the Mont Saint-Michel is on the Norman side, rather than on the Britain side. But the people in Brittany still consider it sort of part of their cultural heritage, if you will.
So what's the science involved in the way the tide works? I mean, here in Hawaii, we don't think too much about tides. But when you get, the East Coast and Europe, especially in this area around England, the tides are Nova Scotia. Don't forget Nova Scotia.
Yes.
The Bay of Fundy, remember? I mean, huge tide, 10, 20, 30, 40 feet in a single day.
Right.
That must happen, at least to some extent, around Mont Saint-Michel.
It's quite famous. They have this thing called the galloping horse tide that comes in. There's some quicksand areas as well. And so it has this reputation of this tide that comes in like galloping horses quite quickly. People have died in the past, so there's if you go there, I mean, the government has set up this bridge and all these other things to visit, and you have to, normally people take a bus from a parking area, but in the past when people were, kind of walking up there in the sands, they, every couple of years they'd lose somebody, So this
What happened to Joe?
Yeah, the tide got him, That was kind of a negative impact for tourism, so.
I recall signs, though, warning you that if you're, in there at a certain time, you're at risk.
Yes, yeah. No, it's quite an impressing tide when it comes in.
Okay, so now to the east of Mont Saint-Michel, to the east of Brittany, is Normandy. Am I right?
Yes, Normandy, yes.
Okay, did you go there?
Not on this trip. I have been to Normandy before, but not on this particular trip.
Can we talk about it anyway?
Sure, if you want, yes.
I went there a few years ago, and I went to the American Cemetery
Yes.
in Normandy. I mean, it's a lot of Normandy is about the war.
Yep.
All the sites along the beaches, and you can see the stuff you've seen in the movies. But when you go to that cemetery, I don't know if you've been there, specifically the American Cemetery, it is a powerful experience
Yeah.
to see those, and they're immaculately kept. I think the American government keeps them under some arrangement they have with France. They are immaculate, and they are laid out by the thousands, and you go there and it just blows you away.
Yeah.
All of the history of this country, runs in your mind. It's an experience just to see it. Yeah.
It always makes me think of that, the opening scene in Saving Private Ryan, where
Right.
he goes there and he's the first time he's come back and he sees all
Exactly.
those rows of.
Me too.
Yeah.
And you see those roads, and you see the movie essentially. Okay, where else did you go?
Well, again, mostly in Brittany. Brittany's kind of interesting because, like Normandy, but even more so, it had been in its own sort of independent duchy, independent of the France. While we tend to think of today of France as the sort of unified nation state, very centralized, which it is, it took a long time for that to happen. So much more so than say in the case of Britain. France took a long time for the French kings to centralize it. And so this kind of plays out during this long, bloody period, the 100 Years' War that we have all these stories about, Henry V and Joan of Arc and all these sorts of things. Brittany, Normandy, all these countries, these duchies get intertwined in it, and by the end of that war, France essentially consolidates rule over these areas. But up until that time, it had been an independent country. So if you just go sort of west of Mont Saint-Michel, there's sort of a belt, what used to be the sort of border, like an international border between Brittany and then the French kingdoms. And these are the sort of marcher areas. The analogy I would give is the sort of border marches between England and between Scotland, where you've got a lot of these castles and people used to raid back and forth, sort of very Sir Walter Scott sort of things.
You can hardly imagine it being, of course the word Britain is in Brittany.
Right, yes.
But imagine having a separate country right there.
Yeah.
And trying to maintain that border, not easy.
Not easy. And in fact, actually, the name Brittany, widely is sort of thought about as being Little Britain, because after the fall of the Roman Empire, people from Cornwall and other areas in Britain nowadays immigrated across the water and they settled. So you had this sort of Celtic movement, and that's where the Celts end up in Spain and other places like that. And they sort of settled, and they took this sort of, but not quite Anglo-Saxon heritage, but the sort of Celtic, sort of British heritage with them. So if you go to Brittany, Brittany has a forest that's, Merlin's forest, and they have the King Arthur
You
stories.
mean Merlin?
Merlin's forest.
The magician man.
Merlin's magician.
All right.
They saw this forest, and they had those stories with them that they took from England, or Cornwall, I should say, and placed them in Brittany. So they have their own Arthur legend. They have their own, all these sorts of things that they took with them.
What was the period of time this was happening?
Basically what we would call the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire. So I guess something like 6th to 7th century AD. And so that eventually becomes the sort of independent duchy of Brittany, and that lasts till about the end of the 15th century. And then eventually the woman, Anne de Bretagne, Anne of Brittany, who is the heir, she was married, basically forcibly married into the French royal family. And so that's how France got control. And you see legacies of that today, because part of the treaty, there were things about limiting taxation on the region. And so so for example, Brittany is one place, there's a motorway. You can go on the motorway like you can most other places in Europe, but there's no tolls on this motorway. And part of it is this sort of cultural tradition that you're not supposed to have tolls on transportation because of this Union Treaty from 1532. And so ironically, the current French government, which has had a lot of problems with budgetary issues, have tried to put new taxes. And there was protests saying, hey, back 500 years ago.
Yeah, we remember. Yeah.
We remember you're not supposed to have tariffs on the road here. So there were quite some agitated protests about these tariffs. So you have this legacy still today. So
Let's take a short break. Patrick Bratton, professor of political science and chair of history and international studies at HBU, talking about Patrick Bratton, Parts Unknown. which actually are known. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen, host of Likeable Science on Think Tech Hawaii. Come join us every Friday at 2 p.m. when I interview interesting scientists about what they do, why they do it, and why we should all care about it. It's a lot of fun to see. We hear, and you can learn interesting stuff. You'll hear all kinds of fascinating science, and we know you'll have a great time. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.
Hi, my name's Hillary Weinberg. I'm the host of The Whole Gamut on Think Tech Hawaii. See us live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. or on our YouTube channel to hear us talk about world affairs from Hawaii and beyond. See you then.
Aloha! How you doing? It's me, Angus McTech, asking you to come join us on Think Tech Hawaii Hibachi Talk. Join me and my two hosts, Gordo the Tech Czar and Andrew the Security Guy, every Friday from 12:45 till 13:45. See you on Fridays, and remember, let your wing gang free wherever you be.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here with Patrick Bratton, professor of political science and chair of history and international studies at HBU. And so he just came back from a trip to Britannia, I was going to say.
Britannia.
That's B-R-E-T-A-N, whoops, B-R-E-T-A-G-N-E. Britannia.
Britannia.
And gee, I mean, it's a very interesting area of France. It's kind of remote from Paris. And, it's not a lot of people up there. Am I right? There's no big city up there, anything like that.
Not too many big cities. The cities that are there are relatively modest. I mean, the two big ones, the biggest city, it's funny, we talked about Mont Saint-Michel earlier. The historic capital of Brittany is Nantes, which is a big port city. Actually, it's where Jules Verne, the novelist, he was from. So a lot of his ideas about travel and exoticism came because he came from Port Town. You see these ships going interesting places.
Sure.
But actually, when the Germans occupied France, they occupied all of those western areas, particularly to build U-boat pens, right, for the war. And they kind of administratively cut Nantes off from the rest of Brittany. And part of it is that there was a bit of a flirtation between the sort of Breton nationalist movement that wanted to be independent of France and the Nazis. And just like the Nazis would work with different disaffected groups, right, to try and get them in their pocket. But the result of this is that city has been broken away from the rest of Brittany. So that was the big city. And you've got Rennes, which is the city I used to live in, which is sort of the university capital.
Spell it.
Rennes. R-E-N-N-E-S.
Okay.
Very lovely city, a very sort of 18th, 19th century city, one of my favorites. And then at the end of Brittany, there's the port city Brest, which is the big naval base. That's relatively famous. But for the most part, not a lot of, it's a fairly rural agricultural. Brittany is normally known for the coastline and seafood, and people go there for the coast.
Not for heavy industry or anything like that.
Not for heavy industry. And then agriculture it's a sort of a farming sort of breadbasket.
Special products agricultural products come from Brittany that are famous?
They're known for a lot of the dairy farms. Dairy farms, pig. They raise a lot of pigs. There's a big pork industry for pork products, types of pate and sausage that are specialty of the area. And they're also known historically for these buckwheat crepes. And so this is the place where the savory crepe, in a sense, comes from France. So they have these buckwheat crepes that they put all sorts of healthy things like cheese and sausage and other things in there. They're quite nice, and they drink it with apple cider, an alcoholic apple cider. That's the sort of very traditional sort of meal.
We did a show on crepes.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and we found one French guy right here in Hawaii, right here in Honolulu. He actually has a truck in Haleiwa who does very good buckwheat crepes. It's really quite good.
Oh.
And there's two kinds, savory and what's the other kind?
The sweet crepes.
That's the savory kind. No, the savory is with heavy
buckwheat.
You could make a lunch out of it.
Yeah, very much
maybe
so.
even a dinner. And the savory has got the other one is the sweet.
Right.
What's
Sucre or sucre?
Okay, yeah. And he has both. They all have both. There's one that's Café de Paris, right here on 4th Street Mall in the land of HBU has crepes.
And there's a lot of I think the founders or some of the workers were French. I go in there sometimes and chat with
founders,
them
not the current owners, yeah.
I think so, yeah. It's been a while. So.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, I remember that crepes are a big deal in Brittany. Yeah. So there's a border there somewhere between what used to belong to Britain and the rest of France. Gee, that seems so unnatural, the border.
It's great. I mean, there's a huge, you see the legacy. There's a whole bunch of castles. It's a great area to see castles. And the Britons built castles on their side. The French built castles on there. And there's one castle I took my son this last time that I went about 10 years ago. We went again just last month, called Fougères. And Fougères it's supposed to be, the advertising, I don't know if this is true, the advertising for Fougères says it's the largest intact medieval castle in Europe. And it's quite large. It's a very large castle that was built to protect the borders. It's quite nice. It's got a river, so it actually has a water moat and all sorts of things. And you can see the architecture of the castles as it goes over time. Because Henry II of England, famous from A Lion in Winter and Becket and all these other plays that we know, Henry II, when he was going in and fighting his wars against the French kings, he burned the original castle of Fougères down. It was wood, and he burned it down. And then they had to rebuild it, and then they built it in stone and so forth. And so it's quite an impressive castle. You can see it's a nice area to see a lot of these intact castles.
So is that what you did? You took your wife and your boy around? I mean, this is a motor holiday kind of thing. Travel those back roads, not crowded, you know,
Right.
and you can really enjoy that. And the food's good wherever you stop. That's so in all of France, isn't it?
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
fall into a restaurant. It's okay.
It's okay. Odds say it'll be good food.
So there are still indicia of British things in Brittany.
Right, there's kind of a dividing line in Brittany. The western parts, which are closer to the coast, tend to have a stronger legacy of this sort of Celtic Breton nation feeling. So you will find people who still speak Breton, which is very close to Welsh as a language, and that's not a lot. It's compared to Wales, it's a very small number, but people still speak Breton. Signs will be in Breton.
Do they understand English?
They do understand, well, French first, right?
Yeah.
And then probably Breton. And
They don't have as much trouble with English as some of the other areas of France?
Well, technically, everybody in school in France has English.
But they refuse to admit it, yeah.
Well, it depends on, a lot of times, I know they have that stereotype. A lot of times what it is that the way that English is often taught in the public university system in France is not very good. And so a lot of times, my read often is that they feel self-conscious about the level of English that they actually have or they think that they have. I'll also say one of the funny things about French people, I would say, is that there's a natural tendency for French people to sort of be grammar Nazis. They really their grammar is very complicated, as anyone who's studied French knows. And they have a thing about wanting to have very perfect, really good grammar. And so they realize when they speak English, they're not going to have perfect grammar, and so they'd rather not speak. It's this kind of self-censorship thing.
Lack
It's
of
kind
confidence,
of lack
yeah,
of confidence. It's a funny thing, but they have this real premium, much more than we do in English, where particularly American English, where most people, I'm not good at grammar. You know?
We're more a melting pot than they have been, really.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
they have
very
some
true.
melting pot. Mostly, you know, you have pigeon everywhere in this country.
Yeah, very true.
Okay, so at some point along the way, you decided you're gonna go to Paris
Right.
for this trip. And this was, right after
A couple of weeks.
the terrorism? Yeah.
Not quite a month after or so. About a month after we have some friends who live in Paris, and also I have some just sort of professional connections. I always like to touch bases with universities that we have links with and things. So we spent a couple of days at the end of the trip in Paris. Took our son to Versailles for one day, but we're in Paris for the.
Oh, that must have been something for him. This was first impression for him?
Really, this is the first time we've done a lot of these historical sites because he's about 6.5 now, so he's, we can do this. When he was earlier, after, half an hour, he's like, Daddy, I'm done. It's like, he's
Not anymore. Now he listens to you.
Yeah, now, sometimes. But he's a little more interested in this kind of stuff, so he's willing to spend the whole day there or something.
Versailles is extraordinary. And I can, see a 6.5-year-old kid is being overwhelmed by just the size of it.
Yeah.
And all the other things, yeah. So did you explain all the history to him at that time?
I explained some of it. I have to do it in short doses, and I have to do it in a somewhat of a fairy tale-like fashion, right? I have to have the more storyteller hat on than the professor hat, right? Because even more so than my normal students, after about 3 minutes, be like, "Daddy, I'm done," right?
It's interesting. The Versailles, was Mary Antoinette and Louis XVI and all that, and it was what's the word? It was an extravagant place. A place that really was, it was used up. There was really no relevance to it and the country. And after the revolution, when they chopped everybody's head off, they kept Versailles.
Yeah.
And it's there today. I think it probably could use a little bit of a spiff up in certain parts, but it's pretty much the way it was. And you wonder why the French, I shouldn't wonder because I know why, but the French respect these pre-revolution structures and institutions more than you would expect. You would expect that they would dash those things, as pre-revolution, but they don't at all. There are a lot of people in France that still adore a life before the revolution.
It's interesting. It's an interesting point you raise. It's a complicated. It's complicated, right? Like many relationships, they have a complicated relationship to this past. I think once the revolution happens, there's this period where they want to really start with a clean slate, and that's one thing that's very different from the French Revolution compared to our revolution with the British. Is that the French revolutionaries really wanted to start, very much influenced by Rousseau, wanted to start anew. So they do all sorts of things. So like the map of France was redrawn. So regions like Brittany we talked about earlier were these big regions with independence. If you look now, the basic building block of administrative organization in France is the department. And the department was deliberately drawn not to actually correspond with historical legacies, but to be this distance that basically an official of the Republic could ride on a horse in one day. And they're all originally about the same size.
They're smaller than states are.
Much smaller.
Or Canadian provinces.
Much smaller, almost like a U.S. county.
Yeah.
And then even like the months of the year, they renamed the months of the year. This is when the metric system comes in. So everything had to be new, right? And so there was a lot of damage done initially to a lot of these royal symbols and things. They wanted to get rid of them because part of the power, in a sense, of the monarchy was the almost the mystical power these things, like the relics, the body of the king, the touch of the king, and these things had. So the revolutionaries wanted to destroy them. Once you get to Napoleon kind of puts the brakes on this because he wants to invest himself with some of this legacy of having a new, when he declares for himself to be the emperor. And so throughout the 19th century, there's this kind of love-hate relationship that the French have with this legacy before the revolution. And eventually they figure out, wow, these are like really big, important buildings with history. Tourists will come here to see them and pay money. And so places like Versailles and other places, turned out to be quite, people say, hey, this is part of our patrimony in the 19th century as the tourism industry gets up. And that, in many respects, that's the thing that saves a lot of this stuff, is that people realize, other people have read about Marie Antoinette, they read about Versailles, they'll come here and pay money, to see Versailles. And it also adds to this symbols, as you well mentioned earlier, sort of symbols of French culture and things. One of the funniest places I've been that's been in the news on a more sad note is the Saint Denis or Saint Denis Basilica up in the north of Paris. This was the main church, sort of the Westminster Abbey for the French monarchy. And so the French monarchy, all the kings had been buried there. There are all these relics to the kings and things. But of course, once the revolution happens, all the bodies of all the kings and the queens were thrown in the ditch, and a lot of these relics were destroyed. And then eventually it kind of gets rebuilt. But because of changing demographics in Paris, this is in sort of basically one of the centers of one of these areas that we always see in the news, the banlieue, the areas where a lot of the descendants of immigrants have moved and stuff. So right now it's mostly a sort of people from sort of North African descent area, very far removed from any sort of posh Paris that you might think of. And it's kind of interesting to visit it today. I visited about a year ago. You're there in this place that has all these symbols from the French monarchy in the midst of one of these areas. Where,
In a slum.
In a slum, one could say.
Saint-Denis, all French words, ring of aristocracy, don't they? Simply because they're French.
Right.
So you have Saint-Denis, this important, historical icon in a slum. How can that be? Let's take a break and figure it out.
Okay.
We'll come back, we're going to talk more about Paris and what you found right after the terrorism. Patrick Bratton, professor of political science at HBU and chair of history and international studies. We're talking about his visits to parts known and unknown.
Aloha, my name is Reg Baker, and I'm the host of Business in Hawaii with Reg Baker. Business in Hawaii is a program that is positive stories about business in Hawaii. We're tired of hearing the negativity and why it's the wrong place to have a business. We talk about the positive reasons for having a business in Hawaii and how to be successful. We broadcast live every Thursday at 2 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Aloha, my name is Kaui Lucas. I am the host of Hawaii is My Mainland, here every Friday on Think Tech Hawaii at 3 p.m. I invite people who are doing interesting and inspiring things in our community to help us keep it local and keep it real. Tune in any Friday, 3 p.m. and also available on our YouTube channel and my blog, kauilucas.com. Hawaii is my mainland. Aloha.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here with Patrick Bratton talking about La Belle France. Did I say that right? Never mind. So now we're moving into Paris, at the center of all France. Although Paris is not exactly in the center, it's more like in the north or the northwest part of France.
Northeast
part.
and that's always been a problem, is that it is quite close to the border. So in the world wars with Germany and things like that.
They had no problem getting there.
Right, it's vulnerable. in a
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. Okay, and you got there. I mean, Paris is really spectacular. I mean, talk about that process of the French loving their culture. I mean, it is a statement of excellence. What they have is it's a treasure, as few other places in the world. And they've managed, by hook or crook, by accident, to preserve this stuff. And they go out and they clean those buildings every now and then. That's really something. And they don't knock them down. Historic really means something in Paris.
Yeah.
The whole city is historic. And then you get to Saint-Denis, it's not so historic.
Right.
But anyway, so you went there just to sightsee, I guess. What did you see?
What we saw Versailles. I took my son to the Eiffel Tower, of course. Actually, confession, it's the first time I've actually been up on the Eiffel Tower. I've seen it.
Really?
Yeah, I've
really?
never done it.
A lot of people see it, but they don't go up.
No, you have to wait in line, and it's quite,
Yeah, right.
It's
It's a restaurant there.
There is, right? The Jules
Expensive.
Verne.
We're talking about really the Jules Verne, is that right?
Yeah, Jules Verne.
Yeah.
There's the pop culture moment, but that's the last Roger Moore James Bond movie has the opening scenes in that restaurant, and he chases Grace Jones up and down the Eiffel Tower. To Duran Duran music.
Perfect. It's good. Well, it's an icon. It's probably the biggest. I mean, after all, if you want to find one icon from France, it would be the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
A great. He was a visionary guy. Eiffel.
Yeah, Gustave Eiffel. He really.
But what did you find in France? I mean, I like to shift it to a little more political look at it. France had been through a trauma.
Yes.
Perhaps it's 9/11, and people were in shock. Not so much they couldn't have COP21 a week later, but they were in shock. They were trying to find themselves in all this. What does this all mean to them? And you must have spoken to people, and you must have gotten, since you're you can speak French, you must have gotten the full brunt of what they were thinking. What were they thinking?
I mean, I think people were shocked, and I think you've got two levels. In a place like Paris, I would say you've got kind of two levels of shock in a sense. There's probably more, but stay two. One is the shock of the French people, and I think there's a sense. I mean, you make the 9/11 comparison. I mean, I think in many ways that's apt. I mean, people. I think one thing as Americans we tend not to think about is that since the 80s, or particularly since the 90s. France and Paris in particular have been targeted by various terrorist attacks going back to the armed Islamic group GIA back in the 1990s with some metro bombings. And so in a sense, they're one could say or argue they're more habituated than we've been to this level of attack. New York City hasn't had that level of attacks. However, on the other hand, much like comparing 9/11 to the 93 World Trade Center attack, I mean, this was sort of another level, or you could say a shift in a sense in the level of violence. And I think that struck people. So there's an internal French shock, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. The other shock, I would say, which surprised me, is the impact this has had on the sort of wider international community, particularly, I would say, in regards to tourism. So, I mean, France and Paris are sort of the world's #1 tourist destination, and I went to a place, and I go to this place to do fencing. I mean, very French. I go to this fencing salle that's in Saint-Michel, which is right by Notre Dame, which is right in the center of a very touristy but also student area.
They have room for fencing there?
It's a beautiful place. It's called Salle Coudrier. It's the oldest fencing salle in Paris. It dates back to 1883, and it looks the same way it did in 1883. It's a wonderful, wonderful
That's
place.
fabulous. That's fabulous.
So I went there to go do it. They were closed, unfortunately. But that area, normally in Saint-Michel on a Saturday night, I mean, you literally, you're pushing through people. I mean, it's that popular of a place between tourists and students.
Think of the second act in La Boheme.
Yes, very much so. I went there on a Saturday night this last time, and it was pretty empty. And that's something I've never seen before. And not a lot of people, a lot of stories in the newspapers, on TV about how empty the Parisian restaurants are, and how much trouble they're having getting tourists. And Paris, and particularly for Christmas, that's a fairly popular,
That's right, it was Christmas time.
tourist destination. And so that's, I think, the shock. A lot of people, that's driven away a lot of the tourist
And
industry.
that hasn't stopped either. That shock effect is probably still going on, at least to some extent, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, and this was, a couple of weeks after, and it was still the case. And so that's something I hadn't seen, and really, particularly, I would say focused on Paris, because I went to a couple of other tourist areas during my trip. I mean, Mont Saint-Michel, Versailles, these other areas. That was all normal. That's all the same. I mean, I don't have the tourist numbers, but from other times I've been there, no qualitative difference. But Paris itself, the city, much, much less tourists. And so that international shock, I think, that was some of a surprise to me. I'd say the other shock, as I mentioned, is the shock internally for the French people. And they've been having a pretty serious debate about what to do in response to the attacks. So France has re-engaged and expanded its international war on ISIS, or as they call it, Daesh. They don't want to call it ISIS. And then also an internal debate. And in many ways, this adds fuel to the existing debates and discussions in France about immigration, about citizenship.
All over Europe, isn't it?
All over Europe.
Germany especially, with the liberal and the conservative, duking it out.
Yeah.
Sometimes vociferously.
Yes, and to an extent, France kind of avoided some of the extremes of this debate because France has not been subjected to the same number of numbers, if you will, of migrants that Germany, Switzerland, some of these other countries have been. France is really, there's been a tendency the past 10 or 20 years for much less immigration than some of these other European countries. So to a degree, that debate had not reached that level that it has in some of the other countries. But with these terrorist attacks happening, that then ratcheted up the discussion. So of course, you have the National Front, the far right-wing sort of nativist populist party has done fairly well in elections, looking forward to the
doing
next.
better now, yeah.
Doing better now.
Exclude all outsiders, all migrants, all foreigners, all that.
Right.
It sounds like Republicans. I'm only kidding. I'm not kidding.
So they're doing well in the polls. The other thing that what happens often in France and French politics when we talk about security and immigration, is that there is a natural pull for both of the other parties, in a sense, to try and co-opt that platform. And so one of the things historically has been when the National Front does well, the center-right party, the Gaullists, particularly under the previous president Sarkozy, they'll try to adopt aspects of that platform. Oh, people want to be tough on immigration, they want to be tough on security, we do that. The thing that's happened now that we have the Socialist Party in power under François Hollande, his government has also adopted that. So his new prime minister that he appointed a couple of years ago has adopted that sort of tough line, if you will. So, in a sense, one
To
of
satisfy people who call for it, yeah?
exactly. So one of the things that I think people have to, when we talk in the United States about the rise of the populist right or something like that, it's not just that. It's also the fact that that shifts the debate, right? So what might have been, here and here is now
Yes,
here and here.
absolutely, yes.
And and it's gotten to a point right now where, at least with the Socialist Party, there's a division. And particularly one of the issues that's really sparked this is about the future nationality of, actually you mentioned about dual citizens. So there is a number of, this debate about if you have a dual citizen person, say French and Algerian, and this person has been accused or held for terrorism or something like that, should the French government strip the French citizenship from that person or not? And then initially after the terrorist attacks, that was a big public calling that, you'd see these papers, debates, this is a good idea. Now there's been more pushback, and particularly in the Socialist Party, there's sort of a division about people who want to get rid of the citizenship, people who say,
Wait, let's not get carried away.
let's
kind
not
of
get
thing.
carried away.
Yeah.
It's also interesting because it gets at a very French thing, which is, again, one thing where the French are very different than the Americans. One of the principles of the revolution is not to make differences between people, because with the revolution, before the revolution, France had three estates: the nobles, the clerics, and everybody else. And one of the ways that you divided that is that people had different duties and obligations and rights. And so the revolution said, no, everybody's the same. And so this is a very strong component of French identity. And so one of the problems with the dual nationality thing is it makes a difference. So if you are a single nationality person, you commit terrorism, France won't take your citizenship. But if you're a dual nationality person, France will take your citizenship. And so this actually gets at a philosophical debate in France. Are we then making a difference between citizens? Because both of these people are citizens, which is not something that is normally done in France. And so it's interesting, it gets at a kind of a philosophical sort of basis of national identity, if you will, in addition to a security question.
Well, the French have certainly had a wake-up call on this. I mean, because they have allowed an enormous number of migrants to come in the country way back when, right? Way back to North Africa and all that after World War II. And settled in, and there have been ripples from time to time about you can't wear that, your national garb here in the schools, and you have to go to school and not be homeschooled or whatever it is. I think this is going to mature those arguments. This is going to change the way it works. People in the administration are going to demand that people, join the French country and the migrants and the Muslims, not stay in their own community. But that's a hard one because it's already well beyond changing that. It's already fixed, I think, in France. And so what's going to happen now? I mean, I'm asking really, what's going to happen? Then you get backlash. You got backlash to the backlash, and there's probably going to be more terrorism too.
Right.
What's going to happen to France? La belle France is under attack. Not in Brittany, by the way. It's only in Paris.
I mean, it's sort of you asked me the sort of $10,000 question. I mean, I think, as you well indicate, I mean, these tensions will be exacerbated. And the thing to keep in mind with the religious thing is that, again, kind of going off of what I mentioned earlier, I mean, the French conception of separation of church and state is very different than the U.S. And so they're very uncomfortable with religious symbols, anything entering into things like the workplace or the classroom or things like that. And so by the very essence of how citizenship and nationality and secularism is conceived in France, it has one could argue it has a much more difficult relationship with citizens who feel that religious identity is part of their actual identity in addition to being French. And so it has a much more conflictual, I would say, or potentially conflictual relationship than dealing with citizenship and religious identity in a place like Germany or the United States or even Britain. Having said that, though, I mean, one of the things that's interesting with France, for all of the problems, and I don't want to paper over a lot of the problems with integration and development and unemployment and things. Up until these recent terrorist attacks, which seem to involve a lot of people who are not actually from the area, there have been, in a sense, some small-scale success stories as well in terms of this issue. So one would hope that, cooler heads prevail, or the dialogue of the discourse comes back to more normalcy. I'm not that optimistic, but just at a kind of a note of optimism. In
Yeah.
a sense, people, there are other debates as time goes on. There are other debates that come in.
But let me offer this. We talked about how the French have tried to, as a retrospective matter, try to preserve their culture from before the revolution and respect all these historical and artistic icons all over the country. And they've done a very good job at that. But while they were doing that, their population was changing. And the classical French citizen is embattled in a way. He lives in Paris. Paris is embattled. But there are a lot of neighborhoods like Saint-Denis and other places in France that have changed dramatically. And I think the classical French citizen in Paris would say, oh, well, that's there, I'm here. We ignore that, and we just, trundle on with our life respecting, the old ways and trying to be just as French as we can be. Those days are gone, Patrick, don't you think?
I'm not sure I go that far. Those days are in tension. But one of the things going back to an earlier thing I mentioned about places like Normandy and Brittany, in the 18th and particularly the 19th century, the France that we know, the France that you mentioned that this French citizen has pride in, is something that is mostly state constructed. And that was constructed at the expense of other regional identities and also other immigrant groups. Because in the 19th and 20th century, France had some of the largest immigrant populations in Europe. So all your political refugees from Hungary, from Russia, these places came over.
That's true. And it was good for the country.
It was good for the country. And France made them French. Not always with a soft, loving hand, often with the hard hand, if you will. So not trying to paper over that. But the French state and the French culture has a history of integrating people. I mean, if you look at Sarkozy, the previous president, son of immigrants.
Yeah.
And so there is that narrative. It's a different narrative than the U.S. salad bowl narrative, right?
We got to close.
Okay.
We're out of time, but this could go on. This is a great conversation. Maybe we can do it again, or you can do it again with your next guest or guest to follow. Thank you so much, Patrick Bratton.
Thank you, Jay. It's a pleasure.
A pleasure, as always. Next week, it'll be your turn.
That's right. I interview you, Jay.
Aloha.